Happy Thursday, everyone. We're going to finish our chapter today. We've talked about asexual reproduction and how mitosis makes identical body cells, identical copies from one parent cell to start. We've seen meiosis and how that is going to now make reproductive cells for sexual reproduction. And today we're going to finish it off actually talking about sexual reproduction, how these kind of half cells, so it's only half the correct amount of information, will recombine to make a fully functional living cell. So just for look at some questions quick. What happens during meiosis? You make gametes. Remember, gametes are those reproductive cells, either egg or sperm, and they have half the correct amount of DNA. So in human beings, our gametes, our egg or sperm cells, have 23 chromosomes, where all of our normal body cells have 46 chromosomes. Why do organisms need the cells made by meiosis? So they can recombine. Should say into. They recombine into a new cell, and this gives variety. I'm going to write these words all over the place. It gives variety. It helps share information from the parents. It doesn't just make identical copies. It gives some diversity in different living things. And at the bottom now, what are haploid and diploid cells? Diploid, di meaning two. That's two copies of every chromosome, or an exosome as an abbreviation, if you ever see that. I don't think I've shown you that so far. And haploid cells are one copy of every chromosome. So these ones, the diploid cells, are going to be the body cells, and the haploid cells are going to be the egg or the sperm cells, the reproductive cells. Remember, just if you're not an egg or a sperm cell, everything else counts as a body cell. That's how we distinguish these. The somatic cells, the body cells, are everything that is not able to reproduce because it only has half the information. So let's move right into lesson 4 and finish our chapter up. We've seen that asexual reproduction has one parent splitting so that it becomes its two identical offsprings. Sexual reproduction, by contrast, has two parents, each donating a random assortment of their own DNA to make offspring that are completely different from both of the parents. This kind of reproduction needs two sex cells, egg and sperm, to combine. Each of them only has half the normal amount of DNA so that they balance each other to make a fully functioning human cell with 46 chromosomes, 23 from each parent. So 23 in the sperm cell, 23 in the egg cell, and they combine to make the full 46 that a normal human body cell needs. Now, all a sperm cell really gives is its DNA. It's tiny compared to the egg cell. The egg cell is really pretty big, and it supplies all the cytoplasm and the organelles. The sperm cell really just goes and kind of injects its DNA into that egg cell, and that will become the whole fully functioning cell. So the egg cell has all the normal organelles plus its own chromosomes. The sperm really just gives the additional other half of the chromosomes. This process of the egg and sperm cells joining to form an entire intact cell is called fertilization. And the first cell that they make, the one with a complete set of DNA, which will now begin to copy itself over and over and over by mitosis to eventually become a fully functioning normal person, is called a zygote. So sperm and egg, or sperm plus egg, equals zygote. This is a sperm cell. And how do we think this thing gets around? It sure looks like it's going to swim thanks to this little flagellum tail that we learned about all the way back in the beginning of the year. But to swim, it needs a watery environment to be able to swim and find an egg cell. Now, we're not going to actually talk about human reproduction at the same time, but assuming you've had or will have or say health class at some point and know at least the basics of how this works, once a sperm cell gets to an egg cell, it releases enzymes and breaks through the protective membrane around the egg. The sperm's headpiece then releases its DNA into the egg cell, but the rest of the sperm will stay outside. So you don't get all of the tail structure and the whole headpiece going into the egg cell. It's just the enzymes break through, and then the DNA itself gets injected or released into the egg cell. This moment here, when the DNA of the two cells gets together and a new nucleus forms around them to complete the new cell, this is called recombination. The genes are recombining after having their numbers cut in half during meiosis. Just to make a distinction between these two kind of similar sounding processes, fertilization is when the actual egg cell and sperm cells join, and then recombination is right after that, as the DNA from each of those cells finally now meets up in the middle of the new cell and makes the new nucleus. Just a new vocabulary word here. Gametogenesis is a fancy term for meiosis since it's the process that forms gametes or sex cells. So not overly important, but it is a word that some people use. I usually don't, but some people out there do. These poor little chromosomes who forgot there was a second half of meiosis. Now that the sperm cells fertilize an egg cell and the DNA is recombined, we have the first complete cell of a new person. To quickly recap these processes, meiosis makes the sperm and egg cells with half the full number of chromosomes, 23 each in people. An egg cell and sperm cell then join during fertilization to make a complete zygote with a full set of 46 chromosomes, and that zygote is the first cell that will grow into a baby. To start the process of becoming a new person, the original zygote cell will divide by mitosis to make two identical cells, and then do it again, and do it again, and do it again, over and over for the next however long a person lives, the rest of their life. One original zygote to 2 cells, to 4 cells, to 8, to 16, 32, 64, 128, yada yada yada, etc., billions of cells. Once it starts dividing, never stops, whether it's to help us grow, repair cells, whatever. At some point in this process, the identical cells need to start taking on specific jobs, though, and they'll have to develop into different organs and tissues. This is called differentiation. We've seen it a few times this year. This is where certain parts of the DNA of each cell get turned on, all the rest of the recipes get ignored or turned off, and a generic stem cell will become a heart cell or lung cell or skin cell or whatever. Here's a little chart very similar to what we did the other day. I think the other day we did was it mitosis versus meiosis? This is now just asexual versus sexual reproduction. So what are some features of these two types of reproduction? Well, in asexual, we know we need one parent, and sexual, we need 2 parents. In asexual, the offspring are going to be identical because it's only the one cell splitting apart, where in sexual reproduction they're going to be very different because it's the combination of genes from those 2 parents. The speed of asexual versus sexual reproduction, we talked about this definitely last week. With asexual reproduction can go very quickly because it's just one cell that can split basically whenever it's ready. It doesn't have to wait for anybody else. It doesn't have to find a mate. It doesn't have to know that the reproductive cells are ready. So it's going to happen very quickly. Sexual reproduction can be slow. It doesn't have to be, but it will be always slower compared to asexual because asexual can literally just happen at a moment's notice. The one cell can just split whenever it has all of its DNA in the right places, basically. In terms of cell division, asexual is going to be mitosis. That's just one cell making 2 identical copies of itself, and meiosis will be involved in sexual reproduction. Once these sex cells combine, you have a new individual. That's now when mitosis kicks in to make more cells and more cells and more cells and help the living thing actually grow. But initially, it's meiosis that leads to sexual reproduction. 2 quick questions to think about here. What type of conditions do sperm need to get to an egg? We just looked at this before. What does the sperm actually look like? Sperm cell's got that kind of little headpiece. It's got that long flagellum tail, so it's going to need a watery environment to swim. This will work really, really well for some living things that already live in that kind of environment. Other organisms are going to have sort of a tough time. That's what we're going to look at now. Different types of fertilization development and kind of getting into evolution stuff that we haven't talked about yet. But how did life develop? How did life change over billions and billions of years to allow this kind of thing to happen in any living thing? Next question, how might this requirement limit how species are able to develop or become more advanced? That's what we're going to look at now. But what do you think? What might have to have developed in living things to let these sperm have a watery environment to swim and find an egg cell if these living things don't actually live in water? What would be necessary? Think about that. Let's move on. We looked quickly last week at the pros and cons of asexual reproduction. It doesn't take too long because there's only one parent cell, so a cell can just basically split again, like I said a minute ago, whenever it needs to. But there's no diversity, so nothing really changes or improves. And very quickly, one bad thing happens to one of the cells, it can happen to every cell, and the entire cell line can get lost pretty fast. Sexual reproduction is the opposite. So we get much more diversity and variation from all those things we saw the other day. That's the combination of different genes from multiple parents, plus all the random scramblings of chromosomes due to crossing over and independent assortment. Going off of the asexual drawback of passing on bad genes over and over again with no chance for improvement, sexual reproduction works well to sort of filter out bad traits in a population. If there's a bad gene that's not helping something survive, the living thing is not going to survive, so it's not going to be inherited most likely. It's probably going to die out before it ever gets to reproductive age, and you're very quickly kind of sort out, filter out, weed out all these bad things, these negative traits. And again, this ties in with evolution that we haven't learned about yet, but if we have these 2 giraffes here and they have necks of different lengths, which one is going to have an easier time getting the food off of this tree? Sure looks like the taller one would be better off, right? And because of that, the genes for shorter necks are very likely to not be passed on to the next generation. If that small giraffe does not last long enough to actually have babies, it's probably not going to get a chance to pass its genes on, and what we're going to see are very quickly the shorter giraffes not show up in the population, and all of the giraffes that survive are going to be the ones that already have the long necks and are able to better find food. We're now going to look at how different types of sexual reproduction have developed over time as life forms have become more advanced. We're talking about the entire history of animals on planet Earth here. So this is an enormous time scale. This is not anything that would happen quick. Again, this is some stuff we'll see in about 2 weeks when we start evolution. But we're going to look at why some animals have external fertilization when egg and sperm combine outside of a body, and why other animals or living things have fertilization inside of a body. Some animals also develop their young outside of the mother's body, while some species have babies that grow inside of the mother. So the difference, and we're going to see why these differences are important and why they're very helpful to living things as they developed over a couple of million billions of years. The first and simplest animals developed in water because sperm need a water environment to swim. This is obviously outside of a female's body, and the animals that reproduced like this were fish and amphibians. These are some of the simplest and earliest things that count as animals. These animals reproduce when the female releases eggs into the water, and the male just kind of swims over them and fertilizes by releasing sperm into that same area. The good thing about this is that a whole lot of eggs can be fertilized at one time. And why do you think that's important? Remember, this is taking place in water, right? So egg and sperm cells may never even meet up. They could certainly just drift away in the water, or even if the eggs do become fertilized, they could then just be damaged or get eaten by a predator at some point before they ever actually develop and grow and hatch into a real fish or amphibian. You've probably seen Finding Nemo, right? So you know how this works. Since the eggs are being fertilized outside in water, they also develop in the water outside of a mother's body. So at this point, they don't need a hard shell. They're really jelly-like and have yolks that feed the developing embryo. Life obviously didn't stay in the water, thankfully, and living things eventually did move on to land. Animals on land are able to be more advanced than aquatic animals, but it's also much less safe on land. The soft jelly-like moist eggs that work fine for fish and amphibians would quickly dry out if a mother laid her eggs on dry land out in the open air. So these animals had to develop hard shells to protect the eggs. Animals with these kinds of hard shells include reptiles and birds. The problem here is that there's a hard shell surrounding and protecting the egg. Nothing goes in or gets out from it, and that includes sperm. The way around this problem is that the sperm needs to get to the egg and fertilize it before the hard shell is even formed, so that land animals use internal fertilization. Sperm and egg meet up inside the mother's body, where a water environment is provided, and the shell then forms around it afterwards, once fertilization has already taken place. The mother then can lay her eggs, each with a hard shell, and the eggs hopefully develop and hatch outside of her body. Animals that use internal fertilization are the next step up from fish and amphibians, so this includes reptiles, birds, insects, and mammals. To be clear about this, mammals do not lay eggs, but I'm listing them here only as an example of internal fertilization. I guess there's the 1 or 2 examples of mammals that lay eggs, but in general, we don't think of mammals as laying eggs. They do use internal fertilization, though. That's the important thought. A benefit of internal fertilization is that the mother's body protects the egg until it's fertilized, but it also means that fewer eggs can be produced at a time since there's only so much space in the body. You have fewer offspring at any given time being produced, but some animals can quickly turn around and just lay more eggs, so it's really not that big of a deal. I do just want to point out before we move on, I did not find these weird pictures. I know they're odd to say the least, and probably not what you're expecting, but other teachers using them, so I just said, sure, why not? And let's move on. I just pointed out that mammals were listed on the last slide, not because they develop externally, but because they use internal fertilization. So far we've seen fish and amphibians use external fertilization and then develop externally too. We've seen reptiles and birds and insects use internal fertilization, but then lay eggs that develop externally outside of mother's body. And now we're going to finish off the last set of options with mammals, the last step on our evolutionary ladder and the last part of our story. A mother's body may protect unfertilized eggs before they're laid, but it would be even safer if the mother protected her young the entire way through development, right? That's what happens with internal development. After the sperm and egg carry out fertilization inside their mother's body, the embryo continues to develop inside of her body in an organ called the uterus. We sometimes call it the womb, and this happens in mammals, but there are actually 2 kinds of mammals that would do this kind of thing. There are placental mammals and non-placental mammals. So placental mammals include humans, and an organ called placenta acts as an intermediate and filter to pass nutrients between mother and baby during pregnancy. The placenta is in the uterus with the baby and passes nutrients through the umbilical cord. The opposite of that, non-placental mammals, are things like kangaroos, who give birth to live young, but the babies aren't fully developed, so they actually crawl back inside the mother's pouch to finish their development and are eventually more or less born twice by the time the whole thing's said and done. That is it. That's all of reproduction. 2 more chapters left. I know I'm shocked too. Go right now, finish the form, and then you've got some worksheets posted up to OneNote. Those are going to be due Monday, 5/18 at midnight. You also have the stuff from the other day if you haven't gotten today, and make sure you get all those done, as well as the forms, the 2 from this week. Extra help is going to be Thursday and Monday, so if you're only watching this on Thursday or later, you missed extra help today at noon. I mentioned the other day it was not going to be Friday because Friday they're letting us back into the building, so that's not going to really work this week. But Monday I will have extra help as well if you missed it. And also remember office hours now on Mondays at 10 a.m. So if you're having nothing to do on Mondays, you got 2 hours to come and hang out. This week I literally sat there and played video games and talked about Star Wars for 2 hours with the kids who showed up. May not sound like much, but it's not a bad way to spend a couple of hours. Other than that, relax over the weekend. Have a great weekend. Stay safe, and I'll see you in a couple of days.